Recording this session, and we won't record every session. It's just so that for folks who miss this session, which is really going to be foundational, that they're getting the same baseline information if they enter into the conversation a little bit later. That said, if you are not comfortable with being recorded, we welcome you to turn your camera off, change your name however you want to, whatever you need to do in order to feel comfortable in this space. Disclaimer over, and also welcome. We're so excited to have you here in this community of practice that has been a long time coming. And we are going to spend a little bit of time explaining who we are, what we're doing here, what we hope you'll do here with us, and then spend some time talking to each other. So I think we can go to the next slide. This is hopefully conveyed in our body gestures and facial expressions, but we're so happy to have you all here in building this community together. So thank you for joining. So you may have heard Leora give a little bit of introduction already, but we're going to repeat that for folks. I'm Francesca Osuna. I am a field coach with the School Crisis Recovery and Renewal Project, or SCRR. I will be your co-facilitator for this community of practice, and we are actually missing our lovely Zero-Eye Buchanan, who is having her first orientation for grad school today. So she'll be joining us and co-facilitating with me in the future, but for now we get to enjoy her picture. And we also have with us Leora, who has graciously agreed to step in as co-facilitator, who is the project director for SCRR. We have Livia managing tech. If you have any tech issues, you can chat to Livia in the chat, and they can help you with that. And also Elisa, who is overseeing both this community of practice and memorialization and commemoration community of practice that is happening at the same time. And Elisa will be joining all of our sessions and taking notes and capturing all the learning. So we all collectively welcome you, and you'll see our faces throughout this series.
That one really good hair day that I had in Tennessee at that one restaurant with the brick backgrounds,
Mm-hmm.
you gotta keep those pictures, y'all, because then
you do, especially in the Zoom world.
Especially in the Zoom world.
So a little bit about SCRR. This is our blurb. We are promoting effective and sustainable change in the ways school communities and school leadership builds the skills, knowledge, and attributes necessary to recover and renew after a crisis. And so what we like to say is that it's so important to be ready for a crisis in school settings, and the way that we respond is critical, and what happens after matters too. And that's the space that we like to occupy in the what happens after the response, after the immediate crisis, and when our nervous systems start to relax and we start to be able to think beyond the next 5 minutes. So that will also be our focus in this community of practice, which we'll talk to you about a little bit more later. So we don't know where folks are coming from today, what your day has already looked like and felt like, but we do want to take a moment to just kind of arrive. So we want to, sit however is comfortable in your chair. Maybe try to sit up a little taller if you are like me and you slouch forward a little bit. And just take a couple of breaths to acknowledge the land you are on and joining us from, the legacies of that land, and who may have been there originally, the moment that we're in politically, health-wise, joy-wise, and just anything else that's happening for you. Just settling into where you are, taking a couple of good deep breaths, and arriving as we get ready to move on. Do some good shoulder rolls like Leora is doing. Some neck stretches. We do invite you to practice breathing or stretching or whatever you need to do throughout this community of practice, even if it means stepping away to get some water or just catch your breath. So our goal for our community of practice is to share our experience and our wisdom to evolve the way that we think together, the way the field thinks and supports and approaches and legislates about suicide postvention in schools. And we'll talk a little bit more about what we mean about those terms too. So here's our overview for today. We're currently in the orientation, the what, why, how, and who We're going to spend a little time setting some norms, and you'll get some time to meet each other. There's lots of you here. Then we will do a little talking about what we mean by recovery and renewal and how we might want to apply that to postvention. So we'll spend some time together, and then we'll send you into groups to have that conversation in small groups. We'll take a little stretch break and share out about how your conversations went in your small groups, and then we'll come back together to get some feedback and talk about what's next. And we will finish up today by 3 o'clock Pacific time, 6 o'clock East Coast time. That's my in the moment math, y'all. It does not always work. All right, and I'm going to turn this over to Leora to talk about why this, why now.
Hi, y'all. Welcome again. I'm Leora. I cannot say it is really meaningful to see so many of you who've been in learning with us this past year at SCRR, who are new to us, who have been colleagues and teachers of ours, both in the world around when the suffering is so much that we feel like we have to exit the world, and also the world around thinking about how we show up for each other, we see each other, and we make meaning with each other after big things happen. And this community practice has many, many legacies and origin stories. Some of you have been our inspirers. I don't know if that's a word, inspirers, which I'm going to make a word because it's also the folks who give us breath, right? The folks who give us who oxygenate us. Part of why and why we're in this moment and why all of us are choosing to use our time for this conversation is that in this last year, an SCRR launched in September of 2020, a project thinking about recovering and renewing after crisis in the middle of many, many compounded and complex crises that we, over the course of last year, heard over and over again from Sherry, from Valinda, from many of you, wanting to have space to problematize and interrogate postvention. And this space is informed by a design team of folks led by Zeruiah, who will be your co-facilitator in the next session, led by Telerita Rogers, led by folks across the country who said, we don't have a space to talk about what happens after beyond the word that I always mess up, Francesca, so you'll have to help me, but beyond contagion. I did it. I always add contagion, which is not a word, contagion. We don't have a space in the postvention world that centers the many ways that folks have been healing in spite of the system and through the system. We don't have a space that centers educator voice and student voice in how we want to heal and make meaning. And so that's what this space is for. And I just came from Racing Aces, which is led by Francesca's team at Trauma Transformed. And Erica Woodland, who many of you know, said the following, said that the most incredible shifts in our collective consciousness happens when we move at the pace of trust. And I want to offer that is why this community practice is held over many months, because this work is really big. We're going to get into a little bit of what this is and what this isn't in a second, but I want to offer us that the word community is the center word in the community practice. We're hoping to really get to know one another, to peer resource each other, and to peer lift each other. And that part of what we're hoping happens is that the doing, the figuring out the protocols and the names and the standards and the practices, that the doing surfaces almost secondarily to the listening, to the interrogating, and to the reflecting. And I think one of our colleagues said, well, what would be a sign of success of this postvention after a year, right? You always have to do those metrics of success for a work plan. And I said, thank you, Canada, for the eye roll. I'm with you on that. And what I want to offer is that it would bring deep, radical joy if we came up with an entire other word for postvention, if we came up with a whole other thing, if we said, this is how 5 years after a young person says the suffering is too much, that this is how we lead community to figure out what have we done to contribute to that suffering, right? We figure out how do we take the shame and stigma from postvention, which is what we've heard from many of you. We can't even talk about postvention because that means that something happened. We know that something is happening. We know that something has happened, and that's why all of us are here today. So before we move on, I know Francesca started us with a pause moment, but I also want to start us with a recognition moment that we would not be in this room today if there weren't people whose suffering felt unheld and unwitnessed. And I want to share as a generational, someone who has intergenerational suicide in my family's history, that I come from a legacy of folks who didn't feel seen and heard, to then generations of folks saying, I don't want to ever not see people again. So I'm just grateful that this community of practice is here for that. And let's see each other, and let's make this community of practice something that we can all learn from. Okay. Breath, 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 shoulder rub, breath, breath, breath. And if I say something, or if we say something that moves fast, or someone else says something, just remind us and we'll put it in the chat for writing. I don't know what could that be shared in the chat, but we want to make sure that it is. So just be explicit, and then we'll help you get what you need to get. Okay, so all that was like big visiony, like woo, 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 woo stuff, big woo woo stuff. And I want to offer you some tangibles because we want to be transparent and trustworthy and trauma informed in our facilitation. So these communities of practice are going to happen every single month, except for December, because we all know by December we might need some space. Maybe we need some space right now. We're hoping, and you can see in your names, if you haven't changed your names already, to your name, your pronoun, role, and where you are in the world, that there is an incredible amount of wisdom from Oregon to Oklahoma to California to New York of wisdom in this room. And that, exactly like what Francesca said, we want to conceptualize what long-term postvention, not just the 2 weeks after a big thing happens, but long-term postvention can feel like, or look like, or stop feeling like, and stop looking like. And we're hoping that these sessions are peer-led. So Kalechi, who's in the room, I don't know, maybe Kalechi teaches a little session, maybe Renee does, maybe Krista, so that we learn from each other and each other's work. Okay, I'm watching, so I'm gonna do this with brevity, even though brevity is not my middle name. What this COP is and what this is not. So we wanted to be really clear from the onset. While this COP could unearth didactic sessions that y'all want more learning about, so you could say, we want a webinar, we love the didactic, we want a webinar on XYZ, and we can build that. This will not usually feel like a sit and get. This is much more of a dynamic conversation point. It's also, we're hoping for this session, this space to feel therapeutic, but it's not intended, even though most of us and some of us are clinicians, to be therapy. So we really encourage you, and we're happy to help you with warm find support if what comes up for you in this space feels like it needs more support than what this space is intended for. We're also going to try and do as much embodiment as possible. So listen, if you want to turn your camera off and be walking around, we know that that's how the body best learns. Do it. Just let's not walk around while we're, talking to someone, because that creates lots of vertigo. We do have a vision for how this community practice is going to feel, but we're flexible and adaptable. So we'll hear from you about what topics and what sessions and what problems of practice you'd like to interrogate and move from there. And then very lastly, we're hoping for this to be a processing space and a learning space and a practice space, all those three things. Okay. Before we move into getting to know each other, these are some of our invitations for how we can show up for each other in this work, in our working environment. I just want to underscore a couple of them, but I welcome you in the chat box to put ones that you feel like, yes, cosign. I would like to put that as my Post-it note on the top of my monitor. I want to underscore a couple, which is that there is only, as Adrienne Marie Brown says, only a conversation that the people in this room can have, and it's our job and our invitation to find it. So all of us are part of it together. And to know that we're really hoping that we embrace curiosity over analysis. We've got a lot of folks who might say this is the wrong way or this is the right way, right? See, Whit's already with me. And part of the conversation is to be more of like, I wonder why that is in place, or I wonder what story drove that policy, or I wonder what assumptions about Black youth is either preventing or benefiting or harming the way policy is enacted, right? So more of a curiosity over analysis. Okay, Francesca, did I miss anything that you'd like me to add / stop talking, Leora, so we can get people into meeting each other?
No, I think we're good. We can go to the next slide. Thanks.
Okay, great.
So we did want to take a moment to pause and set some norms around the language that we use, and be aware that we might continue to evolve the language that we use throughout this community of practice. But what we want to invite you to try out and see how it goes and let us know is instead of saying committed suicide, saying died by suicide, or completed suicide, we would want to say fatal suicide instead. Instead of attempted suicide, we would want to say non-fatal suicide. And rather than saying that someone is suicidal, saying that they might be experiencing suicidal behavior. And that has an asterisk on it because we know that the way that that's framed is not totally aligned with nonviolent communication. So we would also want to invite ourselves to consider what is the need that is not being met when someone is feeling that way. So I think that we can go into our next slide, which
Can I say one thing before we do that?
Yeah.
So there are many of you, like we said, who have deep, deep layers of wisdom. This slide is a starter. And hopefully over the course of the community practice, we can add more and also be in conversation about why nots. Like, oh, I've always been using this. Why not this? So just wanted to start, because that's actually what Francesca just introduced, could be an entire conversation itself. And maybe it should be the language around postvention, right? And so that in itself, because we know that language is one of the most foundational ways in shared language to build a trauma-informed community, that this is our invitation, and let's continue the dialogue as we move forward.
Thank you. So we're going to take a little moment to see who's in the room with us. And this is from everyone who registered. And I'm expanding my screen because these numbers are small on my Zoom screen, y'all. So we have mostly mental health providers with 58% of us in the room. We have 30% of us who provide some other kind of school-based service or activity, and then about 12% of people who are members of the public who aren't in either of those roles but want to learn more about suicide postvention. And then in terms of where we are physically coming from, we have a lot of West Coast representation, including Hawaii and Alaska, which is pretty exciting. And we have a lot of folks from the Midwest and the Southwest, and then about 5 to 10% of folks from the Southeast, Northeast or East Coast, and Rocky Mountain region. So we are coming from lots of different places with lots of different perspectives.
And it's also a reminder when you look at the role. So I'm a credentialed teacher. Francesca is a clinician. That's the beauty of this space, is also the multi-lensi, who knows, multi-role, multi-paradigms that we come into this space with. And some of us are also folks who are coming into the space with lived experience. So the invitation is, as we are meeting each other and building language, that we're also as explicit about acronym that we might be using in shorthand, or a term that we might be using that someone who we're in conversation with may not know. So we want to bring folks in as much as possible.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, we're going to have you do some speed connecting. Livia is going to start getting ready to put you into breakout groups of 3 to 4 people, but not open them up quite yet. When you're in the group, we'll ask you to share your name and pronouns, just sort of introduce yourself and the location you're joining from, what work you currently do, and any thoughts that you have on what expanding and embracing postvention could mean. There's no wrong or right answers. This is just to get everybody's brains kind of firing, connecting to each other. So, and this group of folks is who you'll be with the whole time today. If for some reason there's an issue with your breakout room, there is a button at the bottom of your screen that'll, I think it's blue, and says something like ask for help, and then one of us can come in and support you and problem solve. So you'll have about 2 minutes per person, so we're going to give you about 8 minutes total in the breakout room, and then we'll bring you back together to do a little sharing now. And so
Livia, on your speed dates.
Yeah, Livia, we are ready to open up the breakout room, and for folks who need to step away, that is okay, and maybe just come back when you are ready. Please share them. We are restarting the recording, which is always a little jarring. And if you have any oh, this came up in our group, we welcome you to either share that briefly in the chat or take yourself off of mute and share. Anything that people want to share?
I can share.
Yeah, go for it.
I think one of the things I really appreciate about other communities that you have all created that also came up here is just the importance of language. And so that came up in our group, and it grounds me, and one of the reasons I love these communities. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and I know I got to be in your group and we got to talk a little bit about the language norms that we were setting, and some thoughts and reactions to that. So Leora is saying in the chat that in your group there was a desire to center grief work and postvention. Yeah, I see some heads nodding as we're saying that. Thank you. I'm going to move this on, but we are going to have some more opportunities to connect in the future. So, yeah, if you have more to say, you'll have time to say it.
Yeah, keep putting your learnings in the chat box too. Less about what someone else said, but more about the learning that you want to hold on to for your practice, right? So less like, oh, I heard Kalechi say boo boo boo, rather than like, I was really struck and called to think about this in a different way. Even though we're all struck by Kalechi, always. Okay. Is this me now, Francesca?
This is you now. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Friends, colleagues, many of you have seen this before. Some of you have never seen this. Others of you, who knows, in the middle. The reason that we're starting this next piece, so this next piece to give us a transition mark, this next piece is to give us some grounding language in what we even mean by recovery and renewal. What we even mean by recovery and renewal, because we've been, poor Livia, our incredible program manager, the titles of this has been like postvention times recovery times renewal equals, it's like the longest names of all the times. So we wanted to take some time to say, what do we mean when we're saying recovery and renewal? And when we refer to recovery, what we're really thinking about is the ability and the leadership discernment to sit with what happened and what is happening now. What happened and what is happening now. And that the focus of the recovery stage is on connectedness and commonality, because the biggest thing that happens in a crisis or with crises is incoherence, is chaos, is rupture. Right? And so the work of recovery is to do that trauma weaving, to bring from chaos into coherence, from rupture into repair. Collectively and individually and systemically and environmentally, all the different layers. So we at SCRR assume that folks are in this room and part of our community because something has happened. Either it was a thing or that it is ongoing things. We have some definition of what crises are, but we also problematize how the standard definitions, especially from a clinical lens, has defined what a crisis is. We think that crisis is subjective and should be driven by educators and students, and for us then to respond to that. So we use the work of Judith Herman, 1992, to help us think about the 3 pillars of recovery, of safety and stabilization, and even interrogating what safety and stabilization even means, problematizing that. Who gets to define safety? What does stable actually look like? Of the second pillar of remembrance and mourning. And this has to do, in my small group, there's someone who brings death doula work to this postvention lens. This, the necessity to center remembrance and mourning in our recovery work. So it's not, grief is not like a thing over there. It's like central to the work. And then the last piece is reconnection and integration in recovery. This idea, again, that something has happened and I am going to, in shared community and in significant relationship with witness, integrate the experience into my fascia, which means that when a student leaves our community by suicide or other, they don't just disappear into the land of not being marked by data or by attendance, or they're gone, but that their memory, and both when they lived and also in their death, is integrated into the way that we are as a school community. The other piece, that other R, renewal, is a little bit of a new word. We made it up a little bit, y'all. We did a little bit of a, we're gonna call it this. And it's this idea of what happens the 3 years and the 5 years and the 10 years, so that when my students, who we all experienced the death of their peers together when I taught high school, that their renewal was happening in college, that were in their post-secondary journeys, that the experience that happened 5, 10, 15 years later is still present for us. And we believe that constructing a coherent narrative is essentially part of the renewal chapter, creating the story of us, the story of we. And that's when the healing work happens, the meaning making happens, and the creating and the reimagining. It is not the silver lining, it is not the escapism, and it's not the toxic positivity. It's the rethinking the way that we need to be in order for readiness, response, recovery, and renewal. So I want to offer any reactions. I'm going to go through them quickly in a little bit more focus, and we're going to have time to think about what surfaces when we think about, I'm not a math teacher, some of you are more mathy people than I am, but what surfaces when we think about postvention, schools, recovery, and renewal. So again, going into this recovery piece, I'm going to actually offer either out loud or in chat. When we think about recovery, we usually say that you can tell that we are ready to recover when we are able and willing to reflect. Because that usually means that we're out of the triage stage, we're out of the response stage, we're out of this energy stage, right? No, I got to do. So usually it means that the recovery is opening us into a space of reconnecting and of reimagining why something happened, what it meant that something happened, and how it's still landing with us. And I mentioned in our small breakout group, many of us are throwing around the word recovery for this moment in the pandemic. There are many folks who say we are not even in that phase yet. We're not even in that phase yet. And the other piece that our field director, Jen Leland, always reminds us is that it's actually, and I'm going to just go back, hold on, let's see if I can go back, that it's, this is a nice graphic, but it is not how we experience life. We don't experience life, and especially in schools and especially in harm. First I'm ready, then a thing happens, then I respond, then I recover, then I renew, right? Like, wouldn't that be nice? Maybe not, because then none of us would have jobs. No, I'm just kidding. The recovery, to be real about it, the recovery is messy. We can be responding and getting ready and in recovery at the same time. And we also know, especially because we're centering our anti-racism in our work, that recovery is determined by who has access to healing and who does not. And whose healing is validated socially and by a dominant culture, and whose healing is not. So curious, both out loud, if you wanna raise your hand and unmute or put it in the chat box, like what's coming up for you when we think about recovery and when we think about postvention. And if having a thing right now isn't present for you, gorgeous, because we're gonna offer another time for you. Maybe right now it's just a little percolation happening, a little tagine happening. Oh, Whit, please, yes.
I work with a lot of Indigenous students and from Indigenous practice, and I really appreciate the problematizing, it's my first relationship with that word, of this concept of recovery and remembrance as these set stages that you're bringing forward, because at least in the communities that I am blessed to work with, those are things that all happen at the same time. And, you know, having this linear perspective on step 1, step 2, step 3 takes away the wholeness of how that experience can exist for us in our whole lives. So I really appreciate the message that you all are sharing here. And I'm so grateful that it's been put into this school of practice, because I struggle to articulate that with non-Indigenous practitioners in my community as well.
Heard. Thank you. Okay. Speaking of new things, very briefly, and then we're going to move into some questioning. So when we talk about renewal, and at the very end of this PowerPoint, there are all the links to where you can learn way more about renewal from us in our foundational modules. But we think of renewal as this kind of menudo, or this big pot of gorgeous stew that mixes both coping, the theories of resilience, post-traumatic growth, healing, and meaning making all together. And there's 2 pieces to be clear about. The first is that we learn from folks like Sean Ginwright and Candice Valenzuela and other scholars who really offer us that healing is not escapism and is not dissociation. Healing is radical interrogation of the root cause of harm. And then the co-determination for righting those wrongs. Protest, healing, right? And if you're not muted, I invite you to, just to help with background noise. And then the other piece to hold on to is this concept of meaning making, this idea of creating a coherent story of us. And we're gonna have more programming separate from this that will give us more language and skill into the power of story, but to have someone and have a moment to create an understanding collectively about what is happening and what happened. And what I see, you're still raising your hand. I don't know if that's from before, after, now. Not raising your hand. Okay. Okay. So all that to say, that's why we're here. Postvention, recovery and renewal in our school communities. That combo platter. If I was standing with you in a room, you'd see me moving my body around the room to signal boom, bada boom, bada boom, bada boom. Okay, so now Francesca, I'm gonna just cue you to get ready, because we're gonna start to surface some of the questions that might be coming up for you. So these are some of our essential questions, and you saw this in the invitation to join this community of practice. These are the questions that we're gonna be interrogating with in our community of practice the whole year. I want to be really explicit with you that your facilitators, Francesca and Zarawaya, that they can help, that if there might be a smaller group of you who wants to specifically concentrate on an offshoot of a conversation point, we will set that space up. I want to really be clear that we're not expecting all of this radical and rich conversation to happen in 90 minutes once a month for 8 months, right? So we're going to create the space that the space requires. That's our commitment. Okay. So all that to say, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Francesca is going to share hers, and Livia is going to drop a link in the chat box that opens you to a Mentimeter. And what we're going to invite you to do is a question dump of all these questions that are coming up for you. And the best kinds of questions start with a how might, why might, who might, not what, where, when, how do I do, blah, blah, blah. How might this be? Because it opens us into a space of possibility, which even neurosynaptically is a space of healing and regeneration. So if how might doesn't work for you, go rogue, ignore me. but we're going to open the Mentimeter. I'm going to look to Francesca to share your screen for Mentimeter. I can't find you, Francesca. Oh, there we are. Okay, great. And Livia, can you drop the link to the Mentimeter in the chat box? And we get to just do an anonymous question dump, an anonymous question dump. Okay, lovely. So when you click on that link, you will have the opportunity to just list out all your questions. And some of them could be ours. That could be like, how might we, what might, who might do together? So we'll start to see them appear soon. And then Francesca, you're going to read some of them out.
Yeah, and also if anyone's having challenges with Mentimeter, feel free to let Livia know, and we can try to figure that out. And otherwise, we'll live in the anticipation of what question is going to pop up first.
Francesca, you might need to re-load your screen to be able to see some of the answers.
That is possible. Let's see if that works. Thanks for that.
Oh my gosh, the anticipation, y'all.
I know. The slow turning wheel. Okay.
Okay. Oh,
So many things appeared.
Okay.
It's really exciting for us, y'all. Thank you for your questions. So I'm going to read some of these out because they might be small on your screen. So what does culturally responsive postvention healing look like? Excellent question. How might we help districts develop memorial protocols? How might we, in a system that deprioritizes adult wellness, build spaces that allow for renewal of all members of school community, not just students? Yes, thank you. How might we honor our community's grief while also not giving more attention to the popular people? Yeah, that's something that we talk about, not so much in terms of popularity, but what do we stop and respond to? How do we focus our recovery? How might we destigmatize suicide to be able to lead healing? Yeah, that's a great question. How do we approach schools who are afraid of having the important conversation when a student has died by suicide around liability, regarding the real conversation? Yes, that's definitely something that I heard in my small group as well. How might parents and family members be included in addition to school friends and staff? Yeah, I've heard that in other conversations of there's the school community, but then there's sort of the extended school community. We want to be inclusive. How might understanding grief support postvention? Great question. How might we see recovery and renewal have an ongoing and long-term space in schools? I think that that's what fits here. I'll try refreshing my screen to see if there's more things that pop up.
And we'll send them to folks too afterwards.
We will. And then we ask you to just, whatever window is opened in for you, keep that up because we're going to come back to Mentimeter as a tool later in our time together. So I'm going to stop sharing. So the arrow to this one here actually takes us to the next slide, which has different questions on it. But thank you. I also might learn some more about Mentimeter after we finish.
We'll get all the questions and we'll send these out to everyone so that your questions are seen.
Yes, thank you. So I'm going to stop sharing and then we are going to have some small group conversations that I'll introduce to us. So Lyra, could you share your screen again?
I got you. How many times can we share and unshare? Okay, lovely.
Many times.
So our next piece is to break back into the same small groups, and we're inviting you into two options. Option one is to process and preview about this community of practice, right? That's the kind of this question. So what do you want? What do you hope for this space in this series? How have you learned best in the past? How have you supported your learning the best in the past? Many of you are calling in between meetings. There's something going on in the next room. So the question is like, how might you support yourself in this space? What's worked for you in communities of practice and what has not? So that's option one, is the processing. Option 2 is if you want to talk about postvention recovery and renewal a little bit more. It's like, how might all of these concepts, safety, mourning, remembering, reconnection, be connected to postvention? So it's more, it's digging into some of the more content questions. So one is a little bit more body and the other is a little bit more head in your options. And you as an entire group could choose to go one direction. Actually, that is what we're asking you to do. We're asking you to choose as a group to go which direction you want to go. And Livia is going to drop the Google form link into the chat box. And we're hoping that one person in your group takes notes. There's going to be a first page, and then you have to click next to get to the different conversations. Again, if any of that is confusing, come back to the main room and let me know, and we'll come and help, or just go rogue and be with each other and be in conversation. That's always the best strategy.
Yes, and you'll have about 12 minutes for this conversation, and then we'll come back together and do a little debriefing. And apologies if you can hear the garbage truck outside my apartment.
Always good to know the garbage truck is working. Okay, I'm gonna do our invitation one more time. So our invitation is that we're gonna go back into our same groups. When you're back together again, you have two choices. Option 1, about the community of practice as an experience. Option 2, about the content of postvention, times recovery, times renewal. One person will take the lead in clicking on that Google form and filling in some of the content so that we can start to amass and share out and learn from each other. It's all confidential, so you don't need to say Francesca says that, blah, 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 blah. And then we're going to come back in 12 minutes. Okay. Okay. Can I get a thumbs up either virtually or in reaction? All right, Keela's like, let's go. Beautiful. Okay, thank you. Livia, you can launch the small groups now. So while folks are coming back in, can I just get like a quick poll? How was that using that Google form? That was a new thing we just did. Oh, all right, cool. Into it. Keely, where are you based while we're waiting for folks?
I'm in Oregon.
So many Oregonians. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Welcome. All right, everyone is back. Where is Francesca to spotlight my colleague? Okay. I'm going to spotlight. Great. Okay, Francesca, is it okay if I just put the prompts in the chat, but we keep it on gallery just to listen in to folks?
Sure. Yeah,
Great.
you can
Okay.
totally do that. I'm also gonna invite us to do just like a little stretching while we are sharing out, because an hour and a half is a long time to sit. And if you haven't already, if you were the person in your group who was the recorder and typing things into the Google form, please make sure that you submit that form. Because then after this session, we're going to look at all of your feedback, and then that's going to help guide what we do in future sessions. So, and all right, so I'm going to just give a little time for folks to share out what came up in your groups. And I want to start with the folks who had the conversation about postvention and recovery and renewal, and then we'll have some time for folks who talked about our specific community of practice. So if you have something to say about the postvention recovery and renewal conversation that happened in your group that you want to share out, I invite you to put that into the chat or unmute yourself and let us hear your lovely voice. If it feels helpful, you can also use your reactions to raise your hand so that we can call on folks. So I'm gonna wait and see if anybody raises their hand or puts things in the chat.
Hi, I'm Kath Ann in New Mexico. Thank you guys for doing this. It's a really very timely experience for us at our school, and so I really appreciate this. And we just spoke about some of the qualities that are sort of prerequisites to be in a reflective space, and like how to cultivate that in a school that you know, and with other interdisciplinary people that maybe are, you know, not quite as well practiced or rewarded, so to speak, in being in a reflective practice. And so we just sort of were thinking about what are some of the ways that we could cultivate being in a more process-oriented space in a school when these things don't always sort of line up.
Mhm. Totally. And I really want to highlight and appreciate your use of the word cultivate, that this happens over time and it's not going to happen overnight, and requires us to be intentional about what values, what characteristics we want to create in our schools. Thank you, Kathan, for sharing for your group. Are there folks who want to share? And feel free to raise your hand or just go ahead and start speaking or share into the chat. So I see in the chat, Renee, thank you, Renee, for sharing. So that we discussed the need for all staff to be taken care of during and post-crisis, as well as the importance of self-care to prevent burnout. Yes, absolutely. One of the things that we talk about at SCRR is that often when the crisis happens, you sort of gather your troops to respond to the crisis. But when we're so busy responding, we can forget that we in the troops are also people that are affected by the crisis, and that it's so important to make time and space for folks to be held and loved and cared for as they're responding in the immediate aftermath, and then in the recovery and renewal period as well. We are all.
Can I layer to that?
Yeah.
The other layer that that's coming up for me in thinking about that is also what happens when we realize that we didn't respond with urgency because certain students weren't loved, seen, cared about, or witnessed as much as others. And I think that is a space in this community practice. It is a topic that in my experience in education, we just do not talk about, that there are some students' deaths that matter more than other students. And that own mattering, that own construct is itself material for us to interrogate in this space so that we can then do the work outside. So it might happen. In fact, it would be a gift if in our time together, there's an aha of, oh, wow, a student's life or a family's life or someone is gone and we didn't give them the same that we gave someone else. And how do we actually, where's the restorative justice there?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Whit agrees with you.
I'm Mary from Ohio.
Hi, Mary.
And our group, hi. Hold on just a second, because we went with the document. So Shannon, Melanie, Richard, and I. And our first one was, what are the hopes for this series, is to have some robust conversation amongst each other with meaningful tools that can be put back in place in our areas of practice at a K through 12 institution, discuss the challenges that come up in conversations when speaking to school community, staff and students, and processing experiences in a meaningful way, expand our own thinking about grief and prevention and intervention and postvention. And often we are working in a crisis mode, and how do we get out of that and do more of a planning mode, so that even though a crisis are always there, like how do we as the ones going in as the support keep ourselves with self-care and able to do it. So that was, we didn't get through a lot of those questions. We only got into the two, and then we said, have you learned in the past? The question was, how have you learned in the past in professional settings? And I hate to say, but my career has always been almost on my own island. For 26 years, 29 years, I guess. And it was usually because people who supervised me didn't know my background. Like they didn't know how to work with a social worker or, what the work was exactly. So in one way it was nice because you could have the freedom, but it was more like baptism by fire. So I learned from the professionals around me that were mentors. And then needed, we need to train our schools, we talked about, like our community, our professional development, what are people doing? And then ourselves, we did our own professional development, and that's all we got through on that question. So that's us.
Sounds like you got through a lot. Thank you, Mary, for sharing. And I also heard a lot of hope for this group around sort of meaning making and doing things that are meaningful together. And if you didn't already submit your form, please do that, because we want to make sure that we capture all of the details and ideas that your group had. Thank you for sharing. And you also flipped us into the conversation for folks who were talking about their hopes for the group. So I'm going to read the message in the chat that Amy put in, and then invite folks who had the conversation about what you want this community of practice to be to join the conversation. So Amy said, we talked about the regret that happens within the recovery. Yes. So once that immediate adrenaline has slowed down and you're like, oh, that we could have done something differently. Both making space for that, but also holding that with some compassion and graciousness for ourselves and each other. So yeah, how do we support the regret to get through the regret and cultivate healing-centered meaning from that space? Thank you so much, Amy, for lifting that up. And Kelechi sharing, we talked about safety and who gets to decide it, unpacking what does safe mean when we aren't allowed to have the conversations that we need to have. Yes, thank you. So folks who talked about your hopes for the community of practice, if there were other groups that did that, what came up for you? Again, you're welcome to share in the chat or just unmute yourself and speak up. I'm wondering, okay, I see things in the, so Canada is sharing, I would love to see the qualitative experiences inform ideas for our long-term supports versus the limitations, quantitative and evidence-based, when these kind of modalities fail to meet the needs of diverse groups and nuanced situations. Yes, Lyra is right on target. And Kathleen is sharing, I already feel comfortable that this model will meet my needs as a learner in this community. That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And if in any moment you need us to adjust, let us know, because we are here for you. This is a space for you all. So thank you all for sharing. And we have about 10 minutes left, and in that time, we are going to do another Mentimeter activity, or nope, I'm seeing Liara's face. We're going to do it in the chat.
Actually, I was going to offer these as reflection questions for takeaway, either mulling, either writing, whatever it feels like. I just wanted to introduce them, and you can kind of choose your own adventure with where you take them, because we want to offer some integration, because this has been so we want to do it before you. For those of you who are just listening to the recording, I cannot tell you what I just did with my body, but it was special. Anyway, the invitation questions for our time together is, we're hoping that you feel open to sit with, what do you hope for yourself and your team and who you serve from being in this community practice? What kinds of curiosities will be stoked? What are you comfortable with not knowing? And what are you nervous about? Yeah, where do your nerves get a little bit
Jangly?
Jangly? Yeah, I don't know, shimmy, right? Like, I'm nervous about talking about suicide because it's not something that I'm comfortable with, or I'm nervous about my lived experience with suicide being dismissed, or I'm nervous about I'm just filling in my own blanks right now. No, you can make your own nervous, right? But I think the main question, if there's any question that, for me as someone who's seeing all of you in little squares on my computer, the question that I would love to bold and underscore is, what are you comfortable with not knowing? And again, because this space is not going to be the be all end all, It'll be an opening and exactly what it needs to be. And if there are other pieces of conversation that you feel need to be held, lifted, surfaced, let us know and we will create them and support you to create them for each other. Okay. Do you want to talk a little bit about this part, Francesca? Y'all, we're moving into the closeout. This is us moving into the closeout or the closeout, whatever way the plane is go. I don't know. Yeah, go ahead, Francesca.
We're landing the plane. So on here, you can see a bunch of different topics that we are planning and hoping to talk about. Some will be specific focuses of a session, some will be kind of woven throughout. And we are likely going to reach out to some of you or some of the folks who were on design team to invite you to share your wisdom and experience about some of these topics. So you might hear from us. But we'll be talking about stigma, youth collaboration, doing this work in a way that's culturally responsive, because that's so important and foundational to what we want to do. Contagion, memorialization, people who have ideation or non-fatal suicide, and then thinking a little bit about policy. And if there are other things that are not on here, let us know. Send us an email, put it in your evaluation. And I wanted, we can go to the next slide, and I'm going to connect it to it. So we've developed a resource page that we're going to share out in our follow-up email, which will probably come out tomorrow, where there are a number of resources that we're already aware of, and we're sort of collecting them and putting them in one place for you all. If you have resources that are not on that list, we will provide a link for you to share them with us so that we can add those on as well, so that we're not kind of all in our own corners trying to find information when we can sort of crowdsource it here. So that is going to be available to you. And the other thing that'll be on that resource page is the PDF of the slides for every session. So you can look forward to that. We can go to the next slide, which is a grounding. We just wanted to make sure that we ended our time here by doing a little bit of grounding before we go back to the rest of our day, if you still have more day left in your time zone. So just invite you to kind of notice your body, see where there's maybe a little like twinges of something. And we don't have to judge where our bodies are at or how they're doing, but just kind of notice it. Find your breath. It's like to imagine that I'm gonna blow up a balloon, and it's really like, it's supposed to be a really big balloon, so you have to take a deep breath and really do a long, good exhale. Just give some attention to what is rising up for you in terms of thoughts, questions, how you're feeling. Again, all of those things can be received and noticed without judgment. And if there are things that you want us to know, you can send them to us. And I think we are going to go to our next slide, which is just to say thank you for being here. We're so glad to be building this community with you in response to what folks have asked for, and in a way that feels meaningful and useful and comfortable, or like willing to be in the space together, connected, I think.
A little bit uncomfortable.
Yeah, maybe a little uncomfortable, but staying together, and trying to lean into and through that discomfort so that we can learn together.
Yeah. We are ending now. Livia put a survey link for just this session in the chat box. And Livia, you can put it one more time. We really encourage you. It should take you literally less than 5. That will give us feedback to also help inform the coming sessions. Mm-hmm. I don't know why my mouse is really just, my mouth is as maybe a little bit excited as I am about listening to your practice. But I wanted to end with 2 things. One, I lied to you, 3 things. One is that there's a reason that Francesca and I chose the Redwood Grove as the background image of this slide. And for those of you who have grown up around redwoods, it's because that when one redwood falls, the seeds of that redwood literally fall in a circle and then regenerate in a circle. And I'm just so grateful that we get to create circles, we get to create groves of regeneration, and that really, really clear and conscious that this space comes from a lineage of our pain or folks' pain that either was held or unheld, and the memory of folks' suffering that we are committing to doing the work for and with and by and from. So we're so grateful to be in community with you.